Well, we don't know the exact details of how the hostage handover is going to work, but it now seems clear that a lot of negotiation has been going on in Doha, in Qatar, between Hamas and Israeli government representatives, and no doubt also a few other governments, to ensure that we've got this humanitarian pause, or whatever we like to call it, initially for 4 days, and up to 50 hostages. We understand women and children will be handed to the Israelis, and up to 150 Palestinian women and children who are being held in Israeli jails will be handed over. When it comes to the actual mechanisms of it, one of the interesting things, it appears that Hamas isn't entirely sure where all the Israelis, all the 240 Israeli hostages are. We're expecting a list of those Israeli hostages, the first 10, that is, to be handed over, hopefully tomorrow. The Israelis have already published the list of the 150 Palestinians to be handed over. It is likely that authorities on the ground, potentially the UN, will have a role to play here. And these hostages, as has happened in the past, will be taken to one of the border crossing areas. That is a border crossing between Gaza and Israel, not the Rafah crossing in the south with Egypt, where these people will be handed over. Now, whether they will happen at the same time, at the same place, that is difficult to say. But this is a major step forward, and one is hoping that the guns will fall silent, possibly as early as tomorrow morning. The Israeli forces will be staying in Gaza, and no doubt will be conducting or carrying on their intelligence gathering work, but the fighting should be stopped. And we believe there's a 6-hour window during each day where the hostages and the Palestinian prisoners will be exchanged. This is slated at the moment to go over 4 days. However, we understand that at the end of that 4 days, the hostages will continue, additional hostages will be continued to be exchanged between Hamas and Israel if the ceasefire holds. And as important to all of this, during the cessation of hostilities, there is also the opportunity to get humanitarian aid, a lot of food and medical supplies and power into Israel, into Gaza, and this is likely to come through the Rafah crossing, probably coordinated by the United Nations and other charities. And it's pretty clear that there is a lot of aid stacked up on that border to allow that to happen. So after 6 weeks of fighting, desperate scenes of civilian casualties on both sides, there is a real hope now that there is going to be some good come out of this. And I think it's very important to really, how have we got to this position? The Qataris have been involved in doing this sort of negotiation for some time now with other terror groups. They've negotiated with the Taliban to get hostages and ceasefires in Afghanistan, and they are well-known mediators throughout the Middle East. I think equally important is Iran in all of this. The supreme leader of Iran told the leader of Hamas at the end of last week that Iran would no longer support them. And really, with the support from Iran, from weapons and money, now appear to be dried up, then one assumes that Hamas realized that, the game was very much up for them. And it would appear that the Israeli Defense Force has been inflicting major casualties on the Hamas terrorists. But I think it is important to note as well that Israel stated aims in this war is to return all their hostages, all 240. That now looks like a possibility, but also to neutralize Hamas. And I don't suppose at this stage the Israelis view that Hamas are neutralized. So that activity, once all the hostages are exchanged, might well go on. When it comes to the physical activity of handing over the hostages to Israel, it will undoubtedly go through a third party. I don't think we're going to see a Hamas terrorist turning up to the border with these hostages. One assumes the UN will have a role to play here. The Israelis will, I expect, first of all, want to identify exactly who these hostages are, confirm they're the ones that Hamas is saying, and then to make sure that these people, are straight away put into the medical system. These women and children have probably been underground for the last 6 weeks, probably not well fed, and no doubt terrified. So they will require, a lot of medical support and psychological handling, I expect. So I'm sure once through a third party, they are handed over at the border, they'll very quickly be put into the Israeli medical system. I think it's slightly less clear with the Palestinians who are going to be released. Again, although Hamas does claim to run the medical network in Gaza, and presumably these Palestinian prisoners will be handed over to the Hamas medical network, there is not much of a Palestinian government network in Gaza, and that's one of the main reasons that the place is in such a terrible state. But that presumably is where they're going. There is no talk that I've seen yet that these Palestinians will go to the West Bank, which is also part of the Palestinian territories. So I would have thought, it will be a very different position for the Palestinian prisoners who, one understands, have been well looked after and fed, and good medical facilities in Israeli jails. They're now going into Gaza, a country that's been at war for the last 6 weeks, very short of food, very short of medical supplies, inconsistent electricity supply. So for them, it's psychologically it will be as daunting to go back into Palestine, Gaza, and presumably they'll be going back to their houses. But as we know, a lot of houses have been damaged. So a lot less certain about that. But we also know that there are many thousands of Palestinian prisoners in Israel. So there are potentially those to go across. I mean, what the other significance to this is, for every Israeli hostage that's released, it appears to elicit 3 Palestinian prisoners released in exchange. Now, this might seem strange to a lot of people, but this tends to be the case. Some years ago, when an Israeli soldier was released by Hamas, over 1,000 Palestinians were released. So it's not a zero-sum game, but very difficult for both the hostages coming out of Gaza and also the Palestinian prisoners going back into Gaza. When it comes to the negotiations, a lot of this is shrouded in secrecy. I expect at the behest of the Israelis and no doubt at the behest of Hamas. Now, the people who have been running and driving these negotiations have been the Qataris. In the past, the Qataris have provided a lot of aid to Gaza through overarching sort of organization called the Muslim Brotherhood, who are a group around the Middle East that the Qataris help support and finance. When it comes to individuals, it would appear in the early stages, it is only women and children that are being released. I expect this is probably more at the behest of Hamas than Israel. We know that there are some Israeli soldiers that have been held by Hamas, and the way Hamas works, they probably feel that they can get more leverage out of Israeli soldiers than they can of women and children. So no doubt the men are being left to the end. And I suppose as a quid pro quo, the Israelis are looking at doing the same. But the detail of these negotiations is at this stage not being made public. From what we understand, initially the humanitarian pause or ceasefire or whatever we want to call it is going to last for 4 days. And we understand that the sort of hostage exchange period is going to be 6 hours during those days. No doubt both sides will monitor this very, very closely. And I'm sure if the Israelis see Hamas trying to reorganize or regroup, then they will very quickly go back to kinetic fighting action, as it were. So it's going to be quite a tense period, I think, over the next 4 days. You know, the great hope for everybody is that the ceasefire will extend, because there are provisions in the agreement that it can extend beyond the 4 days if the peace is adhered to for the exchange of more prisoners and more hostages. And ultimately, Israel wants all its 240 hostages back. So I'm sure if at all possible, it will extend it in that guise. Israel will no doubt carry on its intelligence gathering, and not only to keep a track of what's going on, but obviously to keep a track of the Hamas fighters. And Hamas, no doubt, will be doing all it can as well to try and strengthen its foothold. But I think it's also important to say it's very clear that, well, first of all, I think if people don't realize, they should know that the Hamas leadership, the most of them are not in Gaza. They're living in some luxury in Doha and other Middle Eastern capitals. It is mainly just the terrorist fighters who are still in Gaza. So it's going to be an incredibly tense period, I think, over the next 4 days. But you know, the world is sort of holding its breath and hoping that the hostages get out, humanitarian aid gets in, and hoping this might be the start to a much longer peace and some sort of resolution between Gaza and Israel that will provide a longer-term peace in the region.